December 30th, 1941. Dearborn, Michigan. A thin layer of snow blanketed the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge complex. Inside, the clang of steel and hiss of welding torches echoed through cavernous hangars once devoted to Model A Fords. Henry Ford, then 78 years old, stood alongside his son Edsel, surveying engineers as they studied blueprints of a new kind of assembly line. One not for cars, but for warplanes. Just weeks earlier, on December 7th, the attack on Pearl Harbor had thrust the United States into World War II. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had declared, in his address to Congress, that America would become the great arsenal of democracy. The call went out across the nation: convert factories, mobilize workers, and outbuild the Axis powers, the American industrial machine, long idling in the wake of the Great Depression, roared to life. In early 1942, the War Production Board began reallocating materials, prioritizing aircraft, tanks, and munitions over civilian goods. Automakers stopped producing private vehicles altogether. The last civilian automobile rolled off the assembly line in February 1942, a Pontiac Torpedo, before Detroit became the arsenal of democracy. Nowhere would this transformation become more symbolic than at Willow Run in April 1941. Before the United States had even entered the war, Ford had already proposed an audacious plan to the U.S. Army Air Forces to mass-produce the consolidated B-24 Liberator heavy bomber using the same flowline methods that had revolutionized automobile manufacturing. The B-24, with its high-lift Davis wing and tricycle landing gear, was one of the most complex aircraft ever designed at the time. Over 450,000 parts assembled with near-zero tolerance for error. Ford's answer was Willow Run, a plant that would rise from the farmland near Ypsilanti, Michigan, as one of the largest manufacturing facilities in the world. Construction began in 1941 under the supervision of architect Albert Kahn, whose reinforced concrete designs had already modernized the automotive industry. By mid-1942, the site sprawled across nearly a square mile. Its final assembly line stretched over a mile long, with a distinctive L-shaped layout. The east-west leg had to turn south to avoid crossing into neighboring Wayne County, which would have meant paying a different set of taxes. To house the 40,000 workers who would soon be employed there, Ford's team began building entire communities, dormitories, cafeterias, medical clinics, and housing for families. Willow Run wasn't merely a factory. It became a city in the first months of 1942. Even as bulldozers carved foundations and cranes lifted steel girders into place, skepticism ran high. British and American military officials alike doubted whether mass-producing bombers, intricate machines requiring hand-fitted assembly, could be done like automobiles. Henry Ford himself, who had long resisted producing engines for war during World War I, now faced a monumental challenge. He insisted that mechanized precision could overcome complexity. "If you can make cars, you can make anything," he reportedly said to visiting officials. Production began in earnest in late 1942. Early efforts were slow and fraught with difficulties. Aircraft components supplied from subcontractors often didn't fit perfectly, and Ford's autoline engineers had to relearn aeronautical tolerances. Initial output stood at just one bomber every few days. But the system improved rapidly under the leadership of Charles Sorensen, Ford's legendary production chief, known as Cast Iron Charlie. Sorensen worked alongside Consolidated Aircraft engineers to refine the process, introducing new jigs, fixtures, and conveyors to maintain precision while accelerating pace. By late 1942, the first B-24 Liberator rolled out of Willow Run. Serial number 42 to 4010 took flight over Michigan on September 10th, a tangible sign that Ford's experiment was working. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Nazi intelligence analysts began compiling industrial reports on America's war output. German General Albert Speer, appointed Minister of Armaments and War Production in early 1942, received briefings on the scale of Allied manufacturing expansion. Reports from the Abwehr and the Reich Air Ministry described Ford's Willow Run as an industrial complex of unparalleled capacity. German analysts had initially calculated that the United States could not possibly build heavy bombers faster than one every few days. Their own Heinkel and Junkers aircraft required extensive manual labor and custom fitting. When data from intercepted Allied communications and neutral observers indicated that Ford intended to produce one B-24 per hour, Speer's staff refused to believe it. Axis observers in occupied Europe and neutral Sweden sent back similar accounts. Entire American towns were being erected solely to house factory workers. Unlike Germany or Japan, where industrial cities strained under bombing and labor shortages, the United States expanded its production base without halting civilian life. Civilian train services, schools, and consumer manufacturing continued even as bomber output multiplied. By 1943, the scale of America's effort would become undeniable and deeply unsettling to the Axis leadership. The Willow Run workforce represented the changing face of wartime America. Thousands of women joined the lines, many for the first time, filling roles vacated by men who had gone to fight overseas. They became the living symbols of the home front mobilization effort, riveters, machinists, and inspectors who learned to assemble wings, engines, and turrets with remarkable speed. One of the most iconic images of this era emerged from these halls. Rosie the Riveter. Inspired by women like Roswell Monroe, who actually worked at Willow Run installing rivets on B-24 fuselages. Her story was later immortalized in government films, encouraging more women to join the industrial workforce. These workers endured long hours and shifting schedules, often commuting from hastily built neighborhoods around the plant. Despite logistical hurdles, including shortages of housing, transport, and childcare, morale remained high, fueled by a shared sense of purpose. Every rivet, every wing, every test flight carried a clear message. Industrial freedom could overpower tyranny. By the end of 1942, the Willow Run assembly line had begun to achieve what few thought possible. Each section of the bomber was constructed in separate stations, wings, fuselages, tail assemblies, before converging at the final line for integration. Engines were mounted, instruments installed, and paint applied as aircraft inched forward through the massive hangar. When finished, each B-24 Liberator was towed to the adjacent airfield, tested by U.S. Army Air Forces pilots, and flown to operational depots. Ford's engineers didn't merely meet production targets, they redefined them. What had begun as a single-plan experiment would soon lead to the mass production of nearly 8,700 bombers at Willow Run alone, part of over 18,000 B-24s built across all facilities. The world had never seen industrial mobilization on this scale, and as the calendar turned to 1943, the arsenal of democracy would become a decisive factor in the outcome of World War II. January 5, 1943. Willow Run, Michigan. The first light of dawn glimmered off rows of snow-dusted B-24 Liberators parked wingtip to wingtip across the airfield. Inside the mile-long assembly hall, the rhythmic hum of riveting guns and conveyor belts echoed like a symphony of progress. Supervisors recorded each completed airframe's serial number into U.S. Army Air Forces logs, while Army inspectors in olive-drab uniforms checked fuel systems, wiring, and hydraulic controls before signing the delivery certificates. Each bomber bore the stenciled markings of the Ford Motor Company and the insignia of the U.S. Army Air Forces, a white star encircled in blue. The industrial awakening that had begun in 1942 was now in full stride. In just months, Ford's Willow Run had grown from an experiment into the beating heart of America's air power. Across the nation, other giants, General Motors, Boeing, Douglas, and North American Aviation, were expanding their own operations in step with Ford's example. Every factory, warehouse, and foundry seemed to pulse with the same urgency to outproduce the Axis. The War Production Board's January 1943 report illustrated the magnitude of the transformation. U.S. aircraft output had reached an unprecedented rate, more than 4,000 planes a month, compared to only 1,400 the previous year. Tank production had quadrupled. Shipyards along both coasts were launching Liberty ships faster than the enemy could sink them. In Washington, President Roosevelt reviewed these figures with satisfaction. His administration's Victory program, first conceived in 1941, had projected astronomical numbers: 60,000 planes and 45,000 tanks annually. Critics had dismissed it as unrealistic. Yet by early 1943, the United States had already exceeded its planned targets for bombers and cargo aircraft. The key, as German and Japanese analysts would later discover, was not merely industrial capacity, but organization. The seamless cooperation of private industry, federal agencies, and an energized workforce united under one purpose. By mid-1943, the Willow Run plant had grown into a functioning city of its own. Housing developments spread across Ypsilanti Township, known collectively as Willow Run Village. It was home to tens of thousands of workers and their families, many having migrated from the American South or Midwest in search of wartime employment. To support them, the federal government built schools, grocery stores, and recreation centers. Bus routes connected neighborhoods to the factory's gates, running on tight schedules to match the 24-hour shifts. Cafeterias served tens of thousands of meals daily. For many, life revolved entirely around the plant's rhythm. The night shift began as the sun set over the frozen Michigan fields, and when daylight returned, a new team would take their place. Willow Run never slept. Despite the immense scale, the plant maintained an air of personal purpose. Bulletin boards displayed photographs of aircrews overseas flying their bombers, B-24s rolling off the line at Willow Run that now bore names like the Ford Flyer or Michigan Marauder. Letters occasionally arrived from the front, thanking the workers for their craftsmanship. Each message was posted proudly on the factory walls. March 1943 marked a milestone. Under the relentless direction of production chief Charles Sorensen, Ford finally achieved the near-mythical rate of one completed B-24 every 63 minutes. The achievement was recorded by the War Production Board and announced in national newspapers. Willow Run's line had perfected the moving assembly process for a heavy bomber, something no other nation had yet accomplished. Each bomber passed through 25 major stations. Wings were attached by overhead cranes, engines mounted by mobile rigs. Assemblers tightened 313,237 rivets per aircraft using synchronized teams. The final inspection involved 2,000 individual checks before the bomber taxied under its own power to the flight strip. The Ford Liberators then departed in formation, bound for modification centers in Tulsa or Fort Worth, where they would be fitted with combat equipment before joining operational squadrons. By year's end, Willow Run was producing more than 400 bombers per month, enough to equip an entire bomb group every 2 weeks. Across the Atlantic, the news caused disbelief. German Minister of Armaments Albert Speer later wrote in his post-war memoirs, "We were stunned by the reports from our agents that the Americans were building airplanes as we build automobiles. We could not comprehend production on such a scale." In 1943, Luftwaffe reconnaissance missions over British airfields confirmed the growing influx of American aircraft. The B-24 Liberators, B-17 Flying Fortresses, and P-47 Thunderbolts arriving faster than the Reich could replace its own losses. The German armament system, despite Speer's efforts to centralize control and rationalize output, remained constrained by Allied bombing, material shortages, and the demands of total war. By contrast, the United States had achieved what historians would later describe as industrial invulnerability. Factories like Willow Run stood thousands of miles beyond enemy reach, supplied by vast rail networks and fueled by abundant resources. Where the Axis struggled to rebuild after each air raid, American production lines simply accelerated at Willow Run, the human story was as remarkable as the machinery. The plant's workforce included people from every background, men too old for the draft, women new to factory labor, African-American workers overcoming segregation-era barriers, and farmers drawn from across the Midwest. Each underwent intensive training before joining the line. The United States Employment Service, recognizing the unprecedented scale, developed specialized programs to teach aviation mechanics, riveting, and blueprint reading. One worker, interviewed by the Office of War Information in 1943, said, "We used to build cars to make a living. Now we build bombers to make a difference." Despite the round-the-clock schedule and wartime stress, the workers took pride in their mission. The plant's internal newspaper, The Eagle, featured updates from the European and Pacific fronts, reinforcing the connection between the Michigan assembly line and distant skies over Italy, Germany, and the Solomon Islands. As thousands of new B-24 Liberators reached the front lines, their influence was immediate. In Europe, the 8th Air Force used them in daylight raids deep into Germany. In the Pacific, the 7th and 13th Air Forces relied on them for long-range strikes across the vast oceanic distances. The success of these missions was inseparable from the industrial foundation behind them. Every sortie launched from North Africa or the Pacific Islands was backed by the tireless effort of American factory towns like Willow Run, Tulsa, and Fort Worth. By late 1943, Allied air superiority had become a strategic reality, not through sheer numbers alone, but through a logistical ecosystem built from raw American ingenuity and organization. And as 1944 approached, the world would witness the full realization of what began in Michigan. Industrial power transformed into air dominance. January 11, 1944. Willow Run Airfield, Michigan. The winter sun struggled to break through low clouds as a newly completed B-24 Liberator, its aluminum skin gleaming, rolled down the runway. Painted on its nose were the words, "The Spirit of Ypsilanti." Ground crews waved as the four Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp engines came to life, their synchronized roar echoing across the frozen field. Within minutes, the bomber lifted into the sky, one of hundreds that would take flight from Willow Run that month. By now, Ford's production miracle had become a defining symbol of American resolve. In just 2 years, what had begun as a field of farmland had evolved into one of the most advanced aircraft factories on Earth. Its workers, once dismissed as untrained civilians, had become the engine of the nation's war effort. By early 1944, U.S. aircraft production had reached a scale that dwarfed every Axis estimate. According to official War Department figures, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft in that year alone. 34,000 of them heavy bombers like the B-24 and B-17 AT Willow Run. Over 40,000 employees now worked around the clock in 3 shifts. Production flow had become so efficient that a Liberator moved forward every 55 minutes, faster than even Ford's automotive assembly pace a decade earlier. Each day, fleets of new bombers departed for modification centers before joining air groups bound for Italy, Britain, or island bases in the Pacific. The U.S. Army Air Forces could now plan campaigns based on abundance rather than scarcity. When General Henry H. Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, visited the plant in mid-1944, he marveled at the scale. Standing on an elevated catwalk overlooking the production line, he reportedly remarked, "This is not merely production, it's victory in motion." By spring 1944, Willow Run's surrounding settlements had expanded into a vast community of their own. The Federal Public Housing Authority's Willow Run Village contained over 1,300 apartment units, 2,500 dormitories, and facilities for schools, libraries, and clinics. Posters encouraged workers to conserve materials and buy war bonds, while bulletin boards celebrated milestones. B-24 number 5,000 completed. Record output, 25 planes in one day. The factory's internal rail system delivered engines, landing gear, and armament from hundreds of subcontractors nationwide. Trains arrived daily from Cleveland, Buffalo, and Chicago, carrying components that were immediately unloaded, assembled, and fitted. Nothing stood idle. Every motion was timed, measured, and improved. Despite wartime rationing, morale remained high. Cafeterias served hot meals 24 hours a day. Recreation halls hosted dances and community events to maintain a sense of normalcy. For many, Willow Run became more than a workplace. It was a self-contained world, united by shared duty. As Willow Run reached its peak, its output began to reshape the air war over Europe. The 8th and 15th Air Forces relied heavily on the B-24 Liberator for strategic bombing missions. Each bomber leaving Michigan carried a reach and range unmatched by earlier designs. Able to fly over 2,000 miles and deliver up to 8,000 pounds of ordnance. In Italy, B-24s operated from fields like San Giovanni and Cerignola, flying missions against oil refineries, rail yards, and industrial centers in Austria, Germany, and the Balkans. In England, entire bomber groups were equipped with Willow Run-built aircraft, their serial numbers often traceable directly back to the Michigan plant for the crews flying them. The B-24's distinctive twin-tail and Davis wing became synonymous with endurance. Its long range and heavy payload made it indispensable in missions that stretched across Europe, from Ploiesch's oil fields to the heart of the Reich. Within the German High Command, reports from 1944 painted a grim picture. Luftwaffe reconnaissance observed massive concentrations of Allied bombers in Britain and Italy, with numbers that defied prior calculations. Captured documents after the war confirmed that German planners had underestimated U.S. productive capacity by a factor of 4. Albert Speer wrote in his later reflections that by 1944, we had ceased to measure the enemy's aircraft production. It seemed limitless. German engineers were particularly confounded by the consistency of American aircraft manufacturing. Every B-24 that appeared over Europe carried identical specifications, interchangeable parts, and uniform performance, a testament to the precision of mass production. In contrast, Germany's dispersed aircraft industry struggled under Allied bombing. The Reich's aviation plants at Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Bremen suffered repeated strikes that crippled output. Each raid destroyed months of labor. Meanwhile, Willow Run and its American counterparts continued unimpeded, thousands of miles beyond the range of enemy aircraft. In by 1944, over one-third of Willow Run's workers were women, many balancing household responsibilities with full-time industrial labor. Government newsreels and posters celebrated their contribution as part of the national identity. The "We Can Do It" generation that symbolized resilience and equality through effort. African American workers also played a critical role, though often facing segregation and discrimination in assignments and housing. The Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPC, established by Executive Order 8802, helped improve conditions and open skilled positions to workers of all backgrounds. Together, they forged a new social and economic model that would outlast the war, one where industrial unity transcended pre-war divisions. Behind the scenes, Willow Run's success was not just mechanical, but logistical. Ford engineers coordinated with the U.S. Army Air Forces, the War Production Board, and hundreds of subcontractors. Every rivet, hydraulic line, and engine component had to arrive precisely when needed. The government's new Controlled Materials Plan, introduced in 1943, ensured that critical resources like aluminum, steel, and copper were distributed efficiently across industries. This coordination allowed American factories to sustain uninterrupted production even as global demand soared. The result was staggering. By mid-1944, the United States had produced more aircraft than all Axis powers combined since 1939. As 1944 progressed, Willow Run and plants like it became symbols of unstoppable momentum. The War Department released films and photographs showing the assembly line's precision. Endless rows of B-24s advancing toward completion, mechanics tightening bolts, and pilots testing engines before takeoff. In one widely circulated photograph, A line of finished bombers stretched so far that their wingtips seemed to touch the horizon. The image encapsulated what the Axis now knew to be true. America's industrial engine had reached full power. Each completed aircraft was more than a machine. It was proof that a democracy, once mobilized, could outbuild empires. As summer turned to autumn, the momentum continued. D-Day had opened the Western Front in Europe. American bombers from Willow Run struck at transportation lines and fuel depots to weaken German resistance ahead of Allied advances. The industrial heart of the United States was now inseparable from the liberation of Europe. December 24, 1944. Willow Run, Michigan. Snow fell gently over the airfield as another Liberator took off into the gray morning sky. Its serial number, 44 to 51,392, was carefully logged by an Army Air Forces officer before the aircraft disappeared into the clouds, bound for a modification center in Oklahoma. Inside the factory, carols played faintly over the loudspeakers. It was Christmas Eve, yet the assembly lines did not rest. Workers stayed through their shifts, aware that every completed bomber meant fewer losses overseas. 2 continents away, in Europe, the Battle of the Bulge raged. American troops, fighting through the Ardennes forests, depended on supply lines and air support that only the industrial engine back home could sustain. From Michigan to California, America's factories maintained an unbroken rhythm, one that no battlefield setback could silence. By early 1945, Willow Run had delivered over 8,600 B-24 Liberators, a production record unmatched by any single facility in aviation history. But the plant was only one link in a vast industrial chain. Across the country, other factories followed its model. The Douglas aircraft plants in California and Oklahoma produced C-47 transports and A-20 bombers. North American Aviation rolled out P-51 Mustangs at Inglewood and Dallas. Boeing's massive Seattle plant built B-17 Flying Fortresses around the clock. Together, these sites transformed the United States into a continent-sized assembly line. At its wartime peak, more than 18 million workers, including engineers, mechanics, and welders, were engaged in defense production. Even beyond the aircraft industry, the same principles applied. Shipyards in Richmond, California, and Portland, Oregon, completed Liberty and Victory ships in as little as 4 days. Chrysler converted its tank arsenal in Warren, Michigan, into one of the world's largest armored vehicle factories. In Chicago, the Dodge Chicago plant built engines for the B-29 Superfortress, each a masterpiece of precision. Every new production record reaffirmed what Germany and Japan had come to fear most, that the United States could replace in weeks what the Axis lost in months. At By 1945, the numbers told their own story. From 1941 to 1945, the United States produced 324,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.6 million machine tools, 41 billion rounds of ammunition. Behind every figure stood thousands of workers and hundreds of towns that had been reshaped by wartime necessity. What made this feat unparalleled was not just the scale, but the consistency. Every component built to specification, every process documented and standardized. In Europe, the results were visible from the skies. B-24 formations stretched for miles as they crossed the Rhine, striking transportation hubs and fuel depots that sustained the German front. From Italy, the 15th Air Force used Liberators to isolate Axis forces in the Balkans. In the Pacific, modified B-24s of the 7th and 13th Air Forces attacked Japanese supply routes across the Philippines, Borneo, and the South China Sea. The range, payload, and availability of these bombers reshaped the war's strategic balance. What began at Willow Run rippled across every theater. Despite its scale, Willow Run remained an intensely human enterprise. Each department had its own culture and identity. The engine section, the fuselage line, the paint shop. Workers competed informally to set new records for precision and speed. Supervisors tracked output on wall charts, celebrating milestones with banners and photographs. For many, the plant became a source of identity and pride. Workers often referred to themselves as builders of wings. A feature in Life magazine in February 1945 showed a photograph of Ford employees signing their names on a completed B-24's bomb bay doors before it left the line, a quiet expression of ownership and contribution to the national cause. The Army Air Forces frequently sent decorated crews to visit the plant, sharing stories of missions completed and liberators that had originated there. These visits reinforced the direct link between production and victory as the war turned against Germany. Captured intelligence files revealed how profoundly the Allies' production capacity had affected Axis strategy. In February 1945, German Field Marshal Erhard Milch, head of aircraft production, wrote in a report to Albert Speer, "Our greatest enemy is not the bomber itself, but the factory that makes 10 more for every one we destroy." By then, Allied air raids had severely disrupted German industry, forcing plants to relocate underground or disperse production into smaller workshops. Yet no such disruption touched the American mainland. The United States remained a fortress of uninterrupted manufacturing, safe, distant, and limitless in resource. Speer later recalled that his staff calculated the Allies' monthly aircraft production and concluded that the war was lost not on the battlefield, but on the assembly line. In April 1945, with Germany collapsing and Allied forces advancing across Europe, Willow Run's assembly lines were still active. Orders continued under the assumption that the war in the Pacific would extend well into 1946 at the same time. Discussions began in Washington about reconversion, how to transition the arsenal of democracy back to a peacetime economy. The War Production Board prepared plans to return factories like Willow Run to civilian output, just as it had once converted them for war. But until the final surrender, production would not cease. Every day still brought the same ritual: a new bomber completed, a new engine tested, another flight recorded in the factory logbook. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the Willow Run workforce paused only briefly. Flags were raised across the complex, and workers gathered at noon to listen to President Truman's radio address. Within hours, production resumed. The war in the Pacific was not yet over in the months that followed. As the world absorbed the enormity of Allied victory, historians and military leaders alike recognized that America's industrial capacity had been the decisive factor. The United States had not merely matched the Axis in production. It had exceeded every historical precedent for organized manufacturing. Factories like Willow Run had proven that democracy could wield efficiency equal to, and greater than, authoritarian command economies. They had demonstrated that free industry, coordinated under national purpose, could achieve miracles of scale. One contemporary report from the Office of War Information put it. The strength of America was not measured in steel alone, but in the spirit of millions who turned their hands to one task: to build and to keep building until freedom prevailed. By the time production wound down in late 1945, Willow Run had not only built bombers, but also defined a new era of industrial capability, one that would lay the foundation for post-war aviation and the modern aerospace industry. The fields of Ypsilanti, once quiet farmland, had become the proving ground for the might of American industry, a city that built wings for victory. August 14, 1945, Willow Run, Michigan. The sound that had defined the past 4 years, the thunder of rivet guns and the drone of aircraft engines, suddenly stopped. Word spread across the vast assembly floor. Japan had announced its surrender. VJ Day had arrived. Workers dropped their tools and gathered beneath the high steel rafters as the news echoed from loudspeakers. For a long moment, the factory stood in silence. Then, applause broke out. Cheering swelled until it filled the hangar that had built more bombers than any other plant in history. Outside, thousands poured into the warm summer evening, celebrating the end of a global conflict that Willow Run had helped to win. The war was over. But the story of America's wartime cities, and of Willow Run itself, was far from finished. Within days of the Japanese surrender, orders for B-24 Liberators were canceled. The final aircraft to roll off the Willow Run line was completed on June 28, 1945, B-24M-30, FO, serial number 44 to 51,928. It marked the end of a production run that had delivered 8,685 bombers from this single plant and more than 18,400 B-24s across all U.S. factories. Ford engineers gathered to sign the final assembly logbook. The last Liberator was towed to the airstrip for testing and then delivered to the U.S. Army Air Forces. With that flight, Willow Run's wartime mission was complete. The government soon announced a drawdown of contracts, and thousands of workers, men and women who had once filled the plant's 3 shifts, began to return to civilian life. For many, it was their first pause in years. One worker later recalled to the Detroit Free Press. "We'd worked through snow, heat, and blackout drills, and suddenly it was quiet. We realized what we'd built, and how much it had mattered." The War Production Board shifted its focus to reconversion. The question facing the nation was enormous. What would become of the arsenal of democracy now that peace had returned? In the months following VJ Day, the Ford Motor Company returned to automobile production, but Willow Run, designed for bombers, not cars, was an anomaly. Its vast hangars and runways were too large for typical civilian use. For a time, the plant served as a maintenance and storage depot for surplus military aircraft. Rows of decommissioned B-24s and B-17s lined the runways, silent symbols of a war that had ended almost as suddenly as it began. BY 1946. Much of the temporary housing built for the Willow Run workforce, the dormitories, barracks, and village neighborhoods, was repurposed for returning veterans and their families. The settlement evolved into one of the nation's first large-scale post-war communities, complete with schools and civic centers. America was transitioning from mobilization to prosperity. The same energy that had built bombers now fueled highways, homes, and universities. Willow Run's facilities did not remain idle for long. In 1946, the U.S. government transferred parts of the plant to private industry. The Kaiser Frazer Corporation, led by industrialist Henry J. Kaiser and automotive executive Joseph W. Frazer, took over the site to produce post-war automobiles. Their first car rolled off the same assembly line that had once built B-24s, a peacetime echo of the Ford assembly miracle. The runways also found new life. The airfield became Willow Run Airport, serving both commercial and cargo flights. In the early years of the Cold War, it became a strategic aviation hub, supporting both civilian operations and military logistics. By the 1950s, the University of Michigan established its Willow Run Research Center, where scientists and engineers conducted pioneering studies in radar and remote sensing, technologies that would later play key roles in space exploration and environmental science. Thus, the legacy of the plant shifted from building bombers to advancing aerospace technology, continuing its contribution to national innovation. In post-war Germany, surviving industrial leaders studied the Allied model of production with astonishment. Albert Speer, in his 1946 testimony at Nuremberg and later in his memoirs, openly admitted that the Third Reich had underestimated the United States' capacity for industrial mobilization. "What defeated us in the end," Speer wrote, "was the enemy's ability to produce, not just weapons, but entire cities of production." Captured documents revealed that German analysts had known of Willow Run and similar plants, but dismissed the possibility that such facilities could maintain both scale and precision. Their disbelief had been a fatal miscalculation at BY war's end. American industry had not only supplied its own armed forces, but had also equipped entire allied nations through the Lend-Lease program, a logistical achievement that transformed the balance of global power. The Willow Run experiment left deep social and cultural marks on the United States. The women who had entered the workforce during the war proved that industrial labor was not limited by gender. Many continued working in factories or pursued new careers, laying the groundwork for post-war equality movements. The plant had also been one of the largest integrated workplaces in the Midwest. Although racial discrimination remained a challenge, wartime necessity forced the breakdown of some barriers, giving thousands of African American workers new skills and economic opportunities. The experience reshaped the American middle class. War bonds, steady wages, and new manufacturing skills carried millions into home ownership and higher education under the GI Bill. The arsenal of democracy had forged not only weapons, but an enduring prosperity in the decades that followed. Historians, veterans, and former workers looked back on Willow Run as a symbol of what industrial democracy could achieve. The site became a point of pride for Michigan and a lasting monument to wartime unity. By the 1980s, parts of the plant had fallen silent, but efforts began to preserve its history. Museums, archives, and veteran organizations collected photographs, blueprints, and oral testimonies. In 2014, preservation groups launched the Yankee Air Museum's Save the Bomber Plant campaign, securing a section of the original assembly hall for restoration. Today, visitors to Willow Run can stand on the same ground where thousands once worked side by side, building the aircraft that helped turn the tide of World War II. The surviving hangars now house aviation exhibits and educational programs dedicated to preserving the story of American manufacturing power. Each year, restored B-24 and B-17 bombers return to the skies above Ypsilanti, a living tribute to the men and women who built them. Willow Run was more than a factory. It was a turning point in the history of civilization's relationship with technology and organization. It demonstrated that free societies could mobilize for total war without sacrificing their values or freedom. It showed that the ingenuity of ordinary citizens, when unified under purpose, could achieve results once thought impossible. The German officers who first dismissed America's industrial capacity were right about one thing. No nation had ever built entire cities just to make bombers. What they could not foresee was that those cities would also build the future, a future defined by innovation, equality, and endurance. Willow Run was not simply a place where machines were made. It was where democracy proved it could outproduce tyranny. From the thunder of assembly lines to the quiet hum of a restored museum hangar, Willow Run's legacy endures, a monument not of war, but of what a free people, united by purpose, can build.